Senate sources telling The Hill that Kristi Noem's departure from her role as Homeland Security Secretary could open a path to ending the partial government shutdown. Senate Majority Leader John Thune says the change is a, quote, major step that could move Democrats and Republicans on the Hill closer to a deal. For more, we're joined by The Hill's senior staff writer, Alexander Bolton. Alex, where do things stand with the DHS debate, and what could be on the table now that Kristi Noem is gone?
Well, the two sides have been largely at a deadlock for the past several weeks. Funding for the Department of Homeland Security, which has 260,000 employees, lapsed on February 14th. This affects critical agencies like the Transportation Security Administration, the Coast Guard, cybersecurity operations, also FEMA, and disaster relief. And so Democrats are under increasing pressure to reach a deal here, especially as we're seeing lines at airports around the country stretch. It could take up to 180 minutes to get through some TSA lines, and travelers aren't happy. Republicans feel that they can point the blame at the Democrats. Now, the biggest sticking point in these negotiations have been Democratic demands for ICE reform. Specifically, they want federal immigration enforcement officers to obtain judicial warrants before entering someone's home to arrest a suspected illegal migrant. Democrats also want to bar federal officers from wearing face masks. Now, those two reforms are at top the list of what Democrats want to get done, but Republicans say it's a non-starter. So what Republicans are hoping, and I think some Democrats are privately acknowledging right now, is that the ouster of Kristi Noem is a potential reset here. As you just mentioned, John Thune, the Senate Majority Leader, says that this is a major step. This is something Democrats have been demanding for a while, Noem's ouster. And already the potential successor, Markwayne Mullin, Republican from Oklahoma, whom Trump has tapped to replace Noem, is getting better reviews from Democrats. Peter Welch, Democrat from Vermont, called him competent and honest, and he said it's a big upgrade over Noem. So while Democrats aren't going to get the reforms they're demanding, this potentially could give them an exit ramp. And one of my Democratic sources say they are, in fact, looking for an exit ramp here the longer this shutdown stretches on.
Alex, would you say that Democrats are all on the same page regarding Noem's ouster? Do they think it'll change anything about the negotiations? And is Senator Markwayne Mullin, who you mentioned President Trump tapped as the new DHS secretary, offering anything here?
Well, Mullin is offering to sit down with Democrats. He says he will sit down with Chuck Schumer. He says he is open to listening to proposals for reform in the Department of Homeland Security, but he says they have to be practical. So I don't think he's going to give them exactly what they want, but at least he's showing more willingness to engage with them, and that's a big difference compared to Noem, who really wouldn't give an inch. We saw at her Judiciary Committee testimony last week when pressed by Amy Klobuchar. She didn't want to apologize for the way she handled the aftermath of the shootings of these two protesters in Minneapolis. She characterized them as domestic terrorists. There was big fallout from that. She wouldn't give an inch. Mullin, at least, is being more diplomatic with Democrats. Of course, he has worked with them in the Senate. He knows them personally, and that makes a difference here. But there are differences within the Democratic caucus about what to do. Liberals, like Chris Van Hollen and others, say that they are insisting that these reforms happen. Judicial warrants, ban on face masks. They want to stop roving ICE patrols. They want to establish a universal code of conduct governing use of force. There are other things in their 10-point plan they want done. They're not budging, but on the other hand, I think some moderates in the caucus, some centrists, realize that, after all, just as we saw in the shutdown in the fall, Republicans control the levers. They control the White House, the Senate. A little bit unrealistic to expect a government shutdown to change that dynamic. So I think what we could see is some moderates in the days or weeks ahead agitate or even consider voting for a bill to reopen DHS if Mullin is willing to work with them and makes additional changes. But the ouster of Noem as DHS secretary is a major step, as John Thune said.
Mullin will lead DHS starting on March 31st, but he'll need Senate confirmation to permanently serve in that role. What are Mullin's chances of being confirmed by the Senate?
Well, as Peter Welch, a Democrat from Vermont, said, he will be confirmed, and that's because the Senate has changed its rules for confirmation, you only need a simple majority to be confirmed. And I expect Mullin is going to get every single Republican vote. Already, John Fetterman, the centrist Democrat from Pennsylvania, says he will vote for Mullin. So at this point, we're looking at probably, at least 54 votes for him. I think he probably gets over 60 votes. I think that there are Democrats who are eager to have a reset here and have better relations with DHS. And of course, they've worked with Mullin personally. Now, there are some wrinkles here. In particular, Mullin has feuded in the past with Rand Paul, the Republican chairman of the Homeland Security Committee. Mullin has criticized him, and there might be some bad blood there. But I find it hard to believe that Paul would flex his power as chairman to bottle up the nomination, which is something he could do. But I think the bigger picture here is that a number of Republicans thought, and I would add Rand Paul to that list, did not think Kristi Noem did a good job as DHS head. So I think they would all view Markwayne Mullin as an improvement, even though they might have had personal differences with him in the past.
I want to turn to a different topic. President Trump is pressuring GOP senators into passing the SAVE Act. In a social media post, the president threatening not to sign any bills into law until the Save America Act is approved by the Senate. How does that play into the negotiations on the Hill?
Well, I think it casts a pall over getting anything passed through the Senate. I mean, the president is known for his hyperbole and his rhetoric. What he said over the weekend is that he's not going to sign any bills into law until the SAVE Act is passed. And what the SAVE Act would do is require people to show documented proof of citizenship, a passport or a birth certificate in order to register to vote. Democrats are calling this Jim Crow 2.0. They say that it would result in millions of voters being purged from voting lists, and it would lock a lot of people out of participation in democracy. So the Democrats say it's a non-starter. So if Trump really sticks to his threat not to sign any bills until the SAVE Act passes, then that could paralyze the Senate for weeks or months even, and that would not bode very well for a DHS funding deal. I think the reality is that this is more hyperbole. He's trying to put pressure on Republicans to pass the SAVE Act, but that's just not going to happen, because for Republicans to do that, they'd have to reinterpret the Senate filibuster rule in such a radical way that we would see huge fights on the floor, the agenda being locked up for weeks or months as Democrats would be required to engage in a so-called talking filibuster to block the SAVE Act. I don't see that happening. Trump is trying to ratchet up the pressure here, but I think it's pretty clear that Republicans don't want to go along with his plan.
Alex, one more question before we let you go. What economic shocks or job effects are we seeing right now as a result of the shutdown?
That's a good question. It's anticipated that we're going to see up to 10% unscheduled absences among TSA workers. Already, as I mentioned, we are seeing backlogs at the airport. On Twitter this morning, I saw that there were images from the airport in Houston, people waiting in huge lines related to their spring break. That's something that precipitated the end of the last shutdown, which lasted for 43 days. When those lines started to get unwieldy at airports, then that's when there was more pressure to strike a deal. That's why I think, given we're already seeing huge delays with TSA lines, that's why I think that the ouster of Noem opens the path to a deal. But of course, it's being complicated by Trump's threat to veto any legislation, or not sign any legislation until the Senate approves the SAVE Act, which is a non-starter with Democrats, as I mentioned.
Alexander Bolton, The Hill senior staff writer, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.